Good evening, everyone. We'll just, you might hear people joining as we get started, but thank you so much for joining us this evening. I'm Faye, the Wilder Communities Officer in the advocacy team at Cheshire Wildlife Trust. So this evening we're here to raise the profile of the River Mersey and share our incredible appreciation for this amazing ecosystem, whilst also sharing what you can do to protect rivers. So just a bit of housekeeping before we get started. This session is being recorded, so cameras and microphones will be off until the Q&A at the end. We have Emily Lake, who is our Comms and Engagement Officer in the advocacy team, who's helping us with tech support tonight. So please use the chat if you have any issues with the tech, and we'll do what we can to help. So we have 4 speakers this evening, which we're very excited about. First of all, we have Simon Dowell from Chester Zoo, who's going to be talking about the global importance of the Mersey Estuary to wildlife. We're then going to hear from Lorna Selby from Hampshire and the Isle of Wight Wildlife Trust, who's going to be talking about river rights on Hampshire's chalk streams. We're then going to hear from Dermot Smith from the Mersey Estuary Conservation Group, who's going to talk about the Mersey Estuary biodiversity. And finally, we're going to hear from our own James Melling from the Cheshire Wildlife Trust to tell you what you can do to protect the Mersey. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Simon.
Good evening. Thank you very much indeed, Faye, and thank you, Cheshire Wildlife Trust, for inviting me to speak with you this evening. It's a great pleasure to talk to you about the Mersey Estuary. And I'm going to start with my title slide. So as Faye said, I'm going to talk about the global importance of the Mersey Estuary to wildlife and why it's such an important habitat on our doorstep. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Mersey Estuary. I'm sure some of you will be, but you could be forgiven if you look across the Mersey Estuary on a cold, grey winter's day for thinking that this is some sort of kind of ecologically deficient site with not much going on for wildlife. But if you did think that, actually nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, the Mersey Estuary and collectively with some of the other estuaries around it here in the northwest of England, I would say are the equivalent of this. This is the Serengeti Plains in Africa, in Kenya and Tanzania, with thousands of wildebeest distributed across the plain there, and generally thought of as one of the most biodiverse areas on the planet, and thought of in terms of great richness when it comes to wildlife. But the Mersey Estuary is as good as, if not better, than this. And you might be thinking, well, what on earth is he talking about? There are all these wildebeest all over the plains. You don't see large mammals over the Mersey Estuary. Well, you don't see large mammals, but actually, if you go at the right time, what you do see is this: thousands and thousands of birds. And actually, the right time would be about now, actually, in the autumn and going into winter, when there can be as many as 100,000 water birds of quite a wide variety of species that we'll hear about more later on from Dermot in this estuary. I'm going to talk briefly about 7 of the species, and the reason why I've picked these out is because they are the ones for which the Mersey Estuary is not just important locally or nationally even, but actually internationally important. And it's for these species that the Mersey Estuary is designated as a Ramsar site, which I'll tell you about in a minute, and other designations as well, because their numbers at certain times of the year, mainly at this sort of time and into winter, are actually of importance internationally. So these are 4 wader species. These are redshank, black-tailed godwit, dunlin, and golden plover, and 3 duck species: shelduck, teal, and pintail. Now, that's not to say there's many other species as well, and we'll hear more about those later, but these are particularly important on the Mersey. So, as I said, over 100,000 water birds in midwinter on the Mersey, which makes it actually one of the top 10 best wetlands for water birds in the UK. And you can see on this map just where it sort of appears. So if you look at number 10 on this map, that's the Mersey Estuary. And it's part of a suite of estuaries here in the northwest of England, running from Morecambe Bay in the north down to the Dee estuary in the south. So it's part of a really important network of estuaries. And as you can see, it's actually in the top 10. It's number 10 in the hit brigade, if you like, for wetland birds, water birds. But it's part of a really important network for those birds that make the United Kingdom actually a very important country when it comes to waders and wildfowl in winter. And the source of this has come from the annual report of the Wetland Bird Survey. So we know about these birds because of the wetland bird surveys that are carried out by largely amateur ornithologists, actually, every month on the same day each month, so that we can get a picture of how many wetland birds there are across the country at any one time. And some of you may be involved in that. I'm certainly involved in my local area in the wetland bird counts. But the Mersey Estuary isn't only important for birds, it supports some really important habitats that, of course, support the birds. It's got 1.2% of the UK's salt marsh, 1.6% of the UK's mudflats, and of course those are all brimming with life just under the surface, with all the invertebrates that live there that are feeding the birds. It also has an important population of the critically endangered European eel. More about that later. Because it is actually internationally important as well. And recently, the Atlantic salmon population has recovered, and it's been absent for almost a century, but at the end of the last century, it started returning to the Mersey. And it has a number of nature reserves as well, including a 1,500 hectare RSPB reserve. So when it comes to designations, because of the importance of the Mersey estuary's habitats and species, it has been recognised at an international level. And there are three really important designations that I think really matter. I'm going to explain a little bit more about those this evening. So one of those is the Ramsar designation, a Ramsar internationally important wetland site. Secondly, special protection area, which is a designation for its internationally important bird numbers. And finally, a site of special scientific interest, which is for its assemblage of intertidal flora and fauna and the representativeness of the site for estuarine habitats. So let's start with Ramsar. And the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands is an intergovernmental treaty that was adopted in 1971. And the reason why it's called Ramsar is because the treaty was signed in the city of Ramsar in Iran. And it's actually one of the earliest global environmental treaties that was developed and signed by multiple countries. There are now 172 countries that are contracting parties. So that's nearly all the countries in the world, about 90% of them. It protects wetlands of international importance to ensure their sustainable management, and it promotes national action and international cooperation to conserve these vital ecosystems. There are over 2,500 Ramsar sites globally. They cover 2.5 million kilometres squared. And in the UK, we've got 176 of them. I couldn't find a map of the whole UK, but I've got one of England here to show you. And you can see that they do match the coastline quite a bit, but also some inland habitats where you've got big wetlands like Somerset Levels and the washlands in East Anglia, and also some of the peat bog habitats, including some of those around the New Forest area of Hampshire. And the criteria for selection, so the reason why a site gets selected to be a Ramsar site, includes the fact that it has more than 20,000 water birds at any one time. So clearly the Mersey estuary well exceeds that with 100,000 in winter. It also includes at least 1% of the global population of any one species, and we have some examples of that in the Mersey. And it's an important spawning ground or nursery or migration path for fish species, European eel being one of those in the Mersey. So the Mersey Estuary Ramsar site was designated in 1995. It covers 50.33 square kilometres of intertidal sand and mud and salt marsh habitat. And it's part of a wider network of Ramsar sites across Europe that you can see here. And these are genuinely a network. They're not all just designated for their own sort of individual attributes, but they're also considered part of a network because they're part of that network of sites that supports the sort of connectedness of biodiversity. And that is really, really important when it comes to wetlands, because wetlands are important sites for migratory species and particularly birds. So if you look at birds, this map shows the 8 major migratory bird flyways across the globe. And if you look at the yellow arrows in the middle that cross Europe and western part of Africa and southern Africa, this is the one that we kind of sit right in the middle of. And this is a really important flyway for migratory birds. Many of these birds, particularly the ones I'm going to be talking about, they spend the summer in the Arctic or near Arctic sort of habitats where there's an absolute bonanza of food that they can take advantage of, perhaps with fewer predators as well than they would find further south. But of course, during the winter, that habitat freezes up and can't support the food. So they come south, some of them stop with us, some of them go further south, but pass through and stop off on their way to refuel, as it were, as they're passing through. So here are a few examples of species that are part of this flyway that occur in the Mersey estuary. And the first one I'm going to talk about is the European shelduck. Up to 14,000 of these winter in the Mersey estuary. That's 17.5% of the UK population and about 2% of the global population. And this makes it the third most important site in Britain for this species. And you can see there the flyways that a lot of the shelducks that we have in winter in the UK, they actually fly across to the Wadden Sea, which is in Denmark and northern Germany and Holland, a huge area of intertidal mudflats there. And they do that in August. So if you were to go to the Mersey now, you'd see lots of shelducks. But if you go in August, you'd probably be hard pushed to find any. They go across there to molt. And for a long period, for a period of the year, they're actually absent from the UK largely because they're all over molting in that in the Wadden Sea habitat. And then they come back in winter, and some of them stay to breed in the spring. So that's the shelduck. A second bird I'm going to talk about is the dunlin. This is a wader species, one of our smallest waders. And in winter, there's around 41,000 of those feeding in the Mersey estuary, which is about 10% of the UK population and over 0.5% of the global population. And this makes it the second most important site in Britain for the species. And you can see there from the flyways, these are basically, I should have said that these maps are based on ringing, bird ringing recoveries, so where the bird was ringed to where it was recovered. So the straight lines belie actually probably quite a convoluted migratory route, but essentially you're seeing birds ringed in places like Svalbard, right up in the north, and recovered way down in West Africa. And to get there, they have to pass through the UK and stop off in places like the Mersey estuary. And in the winter, many dunlin actually spend the whole winter in the Mersey estuary, and a lot of those are birds that breed in places like Iceland and Scandinavia. And the black-tailed godwit is the other one I want to mention because this one actually is more common on migration than it is in winter. So there's about 500 birds in winter in the Mersey, but that swells to almost 3,500 in the autumn when this red-listed species actually turns up in larger numbers. And as you can see, a lot of the black-tailed godwits that we have in the UK are actually breed in Iceland and winter in the southeast of England. So the Mersey estuary birds in the autumn are often passing through on their way south to their wintering grounds. And it's not just birds that migrate through the Mersey estuary. I mentioned the eel, the European eel. The European eel is critically endangered. That is the IUCN Red List category for European eel, which is the worst, if you like, the highest category a species can be before it becomes extinct in the wild or totally extinct. So the reason for that is because of the very rapid and dramatic decline in European eel populations. And we still don't know an awful lot about their migration, but we do know that a lot of them go out to the Sargasso Sea and return to spawn in our rivers. So European eel, the Mersey estuary is really important for European eels as well. Okay, so just a mention of a few other conservation treaties that are relevant here. So here are a number of treaties. I mentioned the Ramsar Treaty because that's a really important one for estuaries and wetlands. But there's also the Convention on the Conservation of European Wildlife and Natural Habitats, which is sometimes called the Bern Convention because it was signed in Bern in Switzerland. The Convention on the Conservation of Migratory Species of Wild Animals, which was signed in Bonn, so it's called the Bonn Convention and shortened to the CMS. And then there's a Convention on Biological Diversity that was signed initially in Rio in 1992 and is administered now through the biodiversity COP process. And at the COP in Montreal in 2022, COP15, there was a 10-year agreement signed, the Global Biodiversity Framework, which includes targets like 30 by 30, which is 30% of land and sea to be protected for nature by 2030. So sites like the Mersey are really critical for that. So all of these conventions, the UK government has signed up to, has obligations towards, and must enshrine those obligations into law. And in the case of the Mersey Estuary, there are two other designations that have been enacted to ensure it's protected. One of those is the Mersey Estuary being designated as a special protection area, an SPA, and this is designed to protect rare and threatened bird species with similar criteria to Ramsar. So quite similar to the Ramsar Convention. And you can see here that looking at the map, the yellow and green hatched areas represent Ramsar and SPA. So the green hatch is the SPA and the yellow is Ramsar. And when it comes to certainly the middle and upper part of the Mersey Estuary, it's probably no surprise given that the criteria are very similar, that they strongly overlap. And then there's the site of scientific interest, which are designated under the Wildlife and Countryside Act, and is the UK, under UK legislation, designates our best sites for their unique natural habitats. And the Mersey Estuary is one of those SSSIs. And just to mention the fact that these sites, again, they're not all in isolation, they connect up, and even the undesignated land between them is important as corridors for nature. So Chester Zoo, together with the Cheshire Wildlife Trust and other partners, is actually embarking on a huge new project funded by the National Lottery to connect up some of the areas between the Mersey and the Dee, particularly some of the wetland habitats along the Gowie, for example. So just to finish, next time you look across the Mersey, don't see a wasteland. Imagine you're a black-tailed godwit flying over the Mersey Estuary. And what do you see? You see a view like this on a nice day, but actually what you're seeing as a godwit or as a wader is an all-you-can-eat buffet, an absolutely incredible area. And in fact, a real wilderness, one of the last few wildernesses that we have here in the Northwest. Wonderful place for wildlife. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to your questions later on.
Thank you, Simon. I think that was an excellent overview of how important the Mersey Estuary is as an international haven for many species. Remember, there's a Q&A, so if you're on Teams, if you look at the top, there should be a Q&A button. Feel free to submit a question and we'll revisit them at the end of the webinar. We're now going to hear from Lorna, who's going to share the work that Hampshire and the Isle of Wight Wildlife Trust are doing to protect rivers. Great.
Fabulous. So thank you very much for having me. I'm going to speak a little bit about our campaign in Hampshire to grant our rivers rights. So in Hampshire, we have a lot of globally rare and ecologically significant chalk rivers. So that's what our campaign has focused on. But river rights is open to any river, including the Mersey. So don't worry about the chalk streams aspect necessarily here. So I'll take you a little bit through what river rights are. I know it's a new concept for a lot of people, and I've run many community engagement events explaining it to people. So I will also go through our campaign in Hampshire, our work with local councils, and how we've been getting river rights on the agenda. And I'll finish with a bit of advice for the Mersey and how to get involved. So starting off with what are river rights? It does sound like a crazy concept when you hear it at first. I think one of the best ways to think about it is like the rights we give a business, for example. So a business can have a separate legal entity which kind of gives it certain rights, which is separate to its owners. So that's an easy way to think about what river rights really mean and what we're asking for. Under the current UK legal framework, local councils can't actually grant legal rights to rivers, but using the rights that have been created under the Universal Declaration of River Rights, we can start to implement these at a local level. And that's really important for sort of building up this movement and momentum that really we want local councils to be respecting these rights, and eventually the government who can truly grant the legal rights. So the rights that are outlined in the Universal Declaration include a right to flow, a right to perform essential functions within its ecosystem, a right to be free from pollution, which of course is very important with our current situation, a right to feed and be fed by sustainable aquifers. This is particularly relevant in Hampshire, where we've got a lot of over-abstraction pressures on our chalk streams. The right to native biodiversity, which of course is very important for you after hearing about all those wonderful birds coming over. And the right to regeneration and restoration. So this right can support sort of community projects and restoration projects, whether they're the council or community-based. So these are essentially the rights that we are trying to take from the declaration and implement locally, and hope that the government can take them up at a later date after lots of campaigning from ourselves and councillors and communities, of course. So I thought I would run through a couple of case studies of where river rights have already been granted. I expect I will butcher these names, so please forgive me, but luckily you can see them on the screen. So one of the first rivers to be granted rights was the River Wanganui in New Zealand. This river was granted rights because of the important connection between the Indigenous people in New Zealand, and the sort of rights motion recognised that causing harm to the river causes harm to this Indigenous group. And I think really that is something we can all resonate with, like causing harm to the river causes harm to our wildlife, to our water supplies, to our well-being, and really just shows how important these rights motions can be. And it also provides an example of the governance of the river rights motion. So to provide these rights, there's a representative from the Crown in New Zealand and also from the Indigenous group. And I think that really shows how important community involvement with these rights motions are as well. Another example is, I don't know how to say this one, in France. And this one I think is important to talk about because of the reason that they decided to pursue river rights. So there was the threat of a burial waste facility adjacent to the river, which is what caused the sort of government there to pursue this river rights idea. And I think that really resonates with what we're trying to do in Hampshire as well. We're focusing a lot on trying to strengthen planning policy and avoid damaging developments. So this can be really important for pursuing that and really bringing it to the top of the agenda. And then a final case study, which is in England, the first in England to raise the rights of river motion, is on the River Ouse in Lewis. You may have heard about this one. It was getting quite a bit of media coverage a couple of months ago. And this motion was really pursuing a community engagement and behaviour change initiative. There was a lot of work consulting with the community and changing the way people use the river. And also sort of an agreement among local organisations to sign up to a charter to protect the river. So I really just hope this shows that there are lots of different ways that rights of rivers comes about and is motivated by, and also different ways that they are implemented, as it's sort of an emerging and fast-moving movement. There's a lot of freedom to localize it into what's important for your community. So why did we decide to run a river rights campaign? So we can see that this movement is growing very quickly. There's a lot of academic and legal interest. And there's a fabulous Rights of River network by an academic at the University of Southampton. We see councillors being quite interested in this as an area to take up. And of course, it's so important, particularly at a time that it feels national government might not be listening when we're asking for greater protections for rivers and chalk streams, that this is an alternative way to go and speak to people who are listening and are ready to act. It also places pressure on the government to adopt river rights nationally. If as many sort of local councils and local communities are talking about this, ideally the government will adopt it someday in the future. It's also really great to deepen engagement with communities. So as part of our river rights campaign, we posted a couple of community events which have attracted around 40 people in each. So we can help people to understand their rivers and what river rights could do for them locally. And also just great to strengthen your relationships with your local councillors. So on what we've achieved so far in Hampshire, we have had 3 Rights of River motions pass at local councils. So those are Southampton City Council, Test Valley and Basingstoke and Deane Borough Council. These are all quite different in terms of party makeup. So I would say don't feel limited if your councillor is from a certain party. There's been a broad range of interest across parties. We hosted those 2 community engagement events that I mentioned earlier, and I think that's definitely a really important aspect and a wonderful way to get involved to campaign for your local river. We've also achieved extensive press coverage, both locally and nationally. Where this is such a fast growing and new idea, it does get people's attention, and I think bringing the attention to the river is obviously important and so useful for putting the energy towards it in terms of policy making. And we've had councils contacting us for guidance on pursuing rights of river motions, which is really great. It does seem to be once one council does it, the others follow. So hopefully you can follow our footsteps in this way. So I will quickly touch on our work at Basingstoke and Deane Borough Council. So this was the first council in Hampshire to pass a rights of river motion. We worked with the councillors across party to host a community engagement event where we spoke to local people and local community groups across the river about what rights of rivers were, and we helped them feed into the motion that we took to full council. The motion was tabled and was accepted by the council, which was great, but that was only the start of our work. In terms of implementation, there's loads of different routes you can go down, and we're currently working with the council on those. So some examples are we're trying to tighten up the local plan to take account of rights of rivers and have stronger protections for rivers in planning. We are working on the blue and green infrastructure strategy to make sure the blue definitely is represented in there. And we're also working to educate some of the council officers. So we realised that a lot of the officers in the council are experts in their fields, but they might not actually be aware of how important these rivers on their doorsteps are when they're making decisions. So I think that's an important aspect of rights of rivers, is bringing people along with you as well. So what's next? We have 3 more councils who are planning to table river rights motions in the coming months, and we are working more closely with our communities team so they can support engagement initiatives sort of before and after the motions are passed. I've got a picture in the top right there of the goddess of the Wye. There have been discussions about us making a massive puppet for the River Itchen, so that could be exciting. We've also had deeper engagement with legal professionals to provide advice to councils on implementation, and I'm hoping this is going to be some advice that we can provide more generally after we receive that. And we are also hoping to place more pressure on national government. So you may have heard there is there's a Green Lord, who is proposing a rights of nature bill as a private member's bill, and it's currently sort of being written up, and that can bring the rights of nature to the forefront and hopefully get MPs talking about it and Lords talking about it. So when they see this on the groundwork, they will realise the importance of it and that it is so needed. And in terms of getting involved, I imagine that the Cheshire group will cover that, but I'll just give a quick idea. So we have a letter available, a draft letter to local councillors, which asks them to write to table a rights of river motion. So that letter is available on our website, on our Rights of the River page at the bottom, and you can just sort of copy and paste and send to your local councillor. And yeah, reach out to your councillor and tell them about how important your river is, and tell them about the rights of the rivers across England, and hopefully they will want to follow suit. And finally, from me, there is also a government petition open at the moment, which is asking the government to grant rivers legal personhood. It closes at the end of January and it's currently got almost 5,000 signatures. So I will stick that link in the chat, and yeah, feel free to sign now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lorna. It's really amazing to hear how we can protect our rivers, and fantastic that Hampshire and Isle of Wight Wildlife Trust, as well as the local communities, are helping lead the way in the UK. All of these links we'll share after the meeting as well. So we're now going to hear from Dermot, who is going to talk to us about the biodiversity of the Mersey. Dermot, if you look in the top left, there's a button that says take control if you want to take control of your slides. Thanks. And remember, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A and we'll ask them to our presenters at the end.
Okay, I think I'll share my screen, because then I've got the presenters mode in. That's the way I'm used to doing it. Okay, can you see that?
Yes, that's great. Thanks, Dermot.
Yeah. Okay, let me just move that so I can see you as well. Okay, yeah, so thanks for inviting me to talk. So yeah, I'm Dermot Smith, and I've been counting birds on the Mersey estuary since 1994 as part of the wetland bird survey that Simon talked about earlier. So that's a monthly count of all the wetlands in Britain. And what I want to talk to you today about is, the Mersey estuary. I think it's a marvellous place. So I've called it a wild and remote biodiversity hotspot on your doorstep, and I hope to be able to convince you that it is so by the end of this talk. So what do I mean by the Mersey estuary? So the wetland bird survey that I coordinate counts everywhere from Fiddler's Ferry Power Station right down to Fort Perch Rock. So that includes all the intertidal mudflats and salt marshes, and some of the inland habitats as well, like at Frodsham and Hale. So when I talk about the Mersey estuary, that's the area I'm talking about. So why have I called it a wild and remote biodiversity hotspot? Because it is wild. So unlike many of the rivers around, like the Dee and the Ribble estuaries, which have a shipping channel that's been dredged through the river, which makes their processes rather moribund, the Mersey doesn't have such a channel, and so these intertidal mudflats you can see here, the river is free to meander and to erode and deposit in a very natural way. So it's a very wild river. It's very untamed as it flows through this area here. So that's why I call it a wild place. It's also very remote as well, because we've got the Manchester Ship Canal, which cuts off public access for about 13 miles from Runcorn all the way down to Eastham Ferry over here, and so the public can't get access to these huge areas of intertidal mudflats and salt marshes, which is a real shame. And as they can't, I thought I would show you a few pictures of what it's like. So These are quite vast areas. So this is Ince salt marshes. Looks a bit birdless here, but as the tide comes in, it begins to fill up with birds. So we've got lapwing and golden plover here, and then there's a marsh harrier sitting on the marsh here, and then we've got a flock of dunlin flying over the lapwing and golden plover in this picture here. But it's really the intertidal muds that are the most important habitat for the estuary. So all of the birds for which the Mersey is internationally important rely on this intertidal mud. And this is probably one of the habitats that's going to be most vulnerable to anything that they put in the estuary, for example, a tidal barrage. So that's the area around here. So this is Ince salt marshes that we've just been looking at, and the mud area here. This is Stanlow Point down here, and then this is Manistee marshes here. So I'll just show you what it's like on Manistee marshes. So this is a slightly different habitat. It's ungrazed, so it's even more wild than Ince marshes, but it's equally as good for birds. So here's a large flock of dunlin over the Ince marshes, and some shelduck out here as well. But you also get some really good views of the Liverpool skyline. So you've got the Catholic Cathedral and the Anglican Cathedral, and if you look a bit further downstream, as well as the huge numbers of wildfowl that you get here, you'll be able to see the Liverpool Pierhead and the iconic buildings of the Three Graces. Or at least you would have been able to, but if you go there today, you won't be able to see the Three Graces because they've been completely obscured by new development, which means that what was once a World Heritage Site has now lost its status as World Heritage Site. So Liverpool is one of only 3 places in the world that has lost its World Heritage status. And I hope that isn't an indicator of how Liverpool values its heritage. So yeah, looking at some of the data, so I've got a few graphs to show you why it's a real biodiversity hotspot. So this is going back to 1970, showing you that we often get, as Simon was saying, over 100,000 birds wintering on the estuary, and you can see this trend line is showing that there is an increase over that time. So the Mersey is in very good health, and as Simon said, it is actually the 10th best wetland in Britain for birds, something people might not realise because it's not a great birding destination because the access to it is so poor. So I'm going to go through some of the star species for which the Mersey is internationally and nationally important. And just to remind you of what we're talking about in terms of those things, then when I say it's nationally important, it holds 1% of the Great Britain population of that species. And when I talk about internationally important, I talk about 1% of the Northwest European population. And we use 5-year averages of the highest number in each year. So this is what the Mersey is currently internationally important for. So there's 6 species: pink-footed geese, shelduck, ringed plover, dunlin, black-tailed godwit, and redshank. So this is slightly different to what Simon said, because Simon was referring to the designations and what it was important for when it was designated. But what I'm looking at is the most current data for the estuary, and I'm concerned about what it's important for today rather than what it was important for 20 or 30 years ago when it was designated. So some of these species have changed, and I've highlighted in green some of those. One of those species that is a very recent colonist of the estuary, pink-footed goose, and I'll talk about those in a moment. But just to say, that the Mersey is actually the best place in Britain for shelduck. It's also the best place for Canada goose, but as that's a non-native species, we don't really give it a national or international recognition. It's also the 2nd best place for dunlin, ringed plover, redshank, and the 10th best place for black-tailed godwit. So I'll just show you some of those birds in the habitat. Oh, sorry, this is the nationally important species. So we're nationally important for 11 species: teal, shoveler, little egret, cormorant, avocet, little stint, lapwing, grey plover, curlew, turnstone, and ruff. And the green ones are the ones that have become important very recently. But I'm not going to focus much on the national ones. I'm going to focus on the internationally important species. So this is pink-footed geese. So these are birds that are feeding around hail in this photograph, but it's the mudflats for which the Mersey is really important, because they come to roost overnight on the Mersey estuary, using the mudflats as a safe place to roost. And then they leave in the morning, and are quite a spectacular sight as they leave the estuary to go out and feed in the surrounding fields. And say they're quite a recent species, so it was back in about 2018 they started to appear on the estuary in big numbers. And now we get over 13,000. And so what you can see on this graph here is this yellow line is the internationally important threshold, and the orange one is the nationally important threshold. These are the numbers in the bar chart to the right of the birds actually on the Mersey estuary, and then the blue and green line that goes through there is the national UK trend for this species. So I'll be showing a few of these graphs, so I'll use that to illustrate where things are different from the national population. And as you can see, the pink-footed goose has been increasing. Didn't really find the Mersey estuary until a few years ago, but now has found it and really likes it. So the next species for which the Mersey is internationally important and is actually the best place in Britain for shelduck is shelduck, and here's one feeding on the intertidal muds. They love the mud snails that live in the mud areas, and then this is what they look like when they arrive in big numbers. And here is a graph showing the Mersey is internationally important for shelduck. You can see that yellow line, the counts are always above that internationally important threshold, and that the numbers on the Mersey reflect, the UK trends. There's not a big difference there. However, what there is a big difference is, and this is going to slightly contradict what Simon was saying earlier, is the Mersey is extremely important for shelduck in July and August, and is in fact the best place in Britain for molting shelduck. So in the summer, the shelduck lose their ability to fly, and so they want a safe and sheltered place which is rich in food, in which they can spend that time where they grow new flight feathers. And so the Mersey estuary has become the best place in the UK for molting shelduck, which is different to the national picture. So the national picture is at the bottom, shows a peak of shelduck around December and January, whereas the peak within the Mersey estuary is July and August. It's still internationally important through the rest of the year for shelduck, but it's that big peak in July and August for which the Mersey has become important. Next species I want to talk about is ringed plover. So here's one on its own down by Hale Lighthouse, and then here's a flock of dunlin and ringed plover that I photographed off Stanlow Point. And ringed plover, so this is the internationally important threshold. You can see recently the Mersey has been exceptionally important for ringed plover, which is in contrast to the UK population, which has been declining quite rapidly. Part of this increase may well be that when I looked at when ringed plover were occurring on the Mersey estuary, I noticed a massive peak in August, which is similar to the peak for the UK trend for ringed plover. But what it means is they're passing through the estuary on their way on their way south in August, and they may only be on the estuary for a week or so. So our monthly counts would often miss them. But recently we've been targeting ringed plover to make sure that we catch that pulse of ringed plover as they move through. So that would account for the increase in those ringed plover numbers. So what I want to go to next is the dunlin, which is, I think, the most iconic bird of the Mersey estuary. And here's one in summer plumage, which one of my web counters took in May. So it's in summer plumage. But what's interesting here is the ring on its leg here. So this isn't a British ring. I can't quite read the number on it, so I don't know exactly where it comes from. But I'm told by one of my ringers that this is likely to be a Russian ring. So this bird is in May on its way to Russia to breed up there. So this is a lovely one in summer plumage. Mostly the birds we get on the Mersey estuary are in their winter plumage, which is this grey and white colour, which is very nice on its own. But when they get together in big flocks, they form some really spectacular murmurations. So I've just got a few pictures that I took from Stanlow Point of some of the murmurations of dunlin, which I think are quite impressive here. And then I've also got, if this will work, a video of dunlin as they gather on the mudflats in Manistee Bay, just to give you an idea of what they're like and what it's like to be out on the Mersey estuary. Because although it's surrounded by a very urban area, when you're out at Stanlow Point, all you can really hear is the Dunlin and Redshank that are calling in this. So if I'm quiet, you can maybe hear some of the sights and sounds. Okay, and so moving on to look at some of the data on Dunlin. So again, these are the counts going back to 1970s, and the red line is showing the Mersey is still very important for Dunlin and actually increasing, as opposed to the national trend for Dunlin, which is a decrease. And we've actually had our 3 highest counts in the last few years for Dunlin. So the Mersey estuary is incredibly important for Dunlin, and has for most of the time I've been counting been the #1 place for Dunlin. It has recently been put into second place by the Ribble, because they had an exceptional count of 84,000. Our average count is about 40,000, but I think we'll soon be back on as #1 for Dunlin. Mersey estuary is the 10th best place for black-tailed godwit, which Simon talked about earlier. So here's one in lovely summer plumage, and we get them in pretty big flocks, which are pretty spectacular. These are also a fairly new species for the estuary. Back when I started counting in 1994, I saw the first flock of about 300, and they've increased steadily to usually well over 3,000, and so on. We've had up to 6,000 birds on the estuary, and that's in line with the national trend for black-tailed godwit. And then the redshank is the other species for which the Mersey estuary is internationally important. So the second best place in Britain for redshank, and as you can see from the graph here, always internationally important for redshank, and the numbers on the Mersey do mirror the national trends. So just to go back over what I've just been saying, internationally important for 6 species, and for some of those species like shelduck, Dunlin, ring plover and redshank were either the best or the second best place in the UK, and nationally important for 11 species of birds. I'm not really going to talk about the nationally important ones, but just do a couple of pictures of a little egret eating a stickleback here, and some cormorants breeding at Hale Decoy, and just show you this little graph here. So this is birds breeding at Hale Decoy. So we have cock grey herons, which have always bred there, but in 2015 cormorants started to breeding, and now we've got a really big colony of breeding cormorants. And in 2020 little egret started breeding at Hale Decoy, so we've got an increase there as well of birds. And then finally, just a species I never thought I'd see in big numbers on the Mersey estuary when I started counting in the 90s. Avocet, we now get over 200 avocets on the estuary. So yeah, there are some quite significant changes been happening, but the bird numbers are staying well up. So hopefully I've convinced you that the Mersey estuary is a really wild and remote biodiversity hotspot on your doorstep. If you're interested in helping with any of the counts, then send me an email. If you just want to find out what's happening on the Mersey estuary, then look at the Facebook page.
Amazing. What an incredible assemblage we have on our doorstep. Thank you so much, Dermot, for sharing all your local expertise with us, and we'll make sure to share webs in the follow-up to this as well. Please remember, pop any questions in the Q&A if you have any for Dermot. We're now going to hear from James from Cheshire Wildlife Trust, who's going to explain why we're saying we need to fight for the River Mersey and what Cheshire Wildlife Trust are doing to protect it.
Fantastic. Okay, so I'm James and I'm the Public Affairs Manager here at Cheshire Wildlife Trust. So I think the whole point, as Faye was saying, of this webinar today was for you to sort of get a bit of a flavour for why the Mersey is so amazing, but not just to leave it there, to think about then what we can do about it, because there are threats on the horizon. Some of them have been alluded to today through the speakers. Dermot just before was alluding to sort of how development pressure is becoming sort of an increasing threat to sort of this really important ecosystem. And obviously, like, we've got a lot of other issues in the media that have come to our attention. So I'll start off, I suppose, with this one. The film was slightly skewed, but The sewage crisis, I suppose, is something we're all quite familiar with now. In the last sort of couple of years, we've seen how this is really gaining traction in the media because there's been outrage. We've got spaces as important as this that are being impacted by sewage pollution. And I suppose I should say it's not just water, sewage pollution. There's lots of other different sources, from agriculture to industry, waste as well. But I think this one's really captured public anger in sort of the campaign sphere because it just shouldn't be happening. It sounds like something that should have happened about 10, well, not 10, so more 100 plus years ago, rather than something that should be happening today. And I pulled this yesterday, so this is as close to live as you get. This is from River Action's website, showing all the different combined sewage overflow outputs across sort of the Mersey Basin area. And you can just see there, every sort of red dot on there is an outlet that's been discharging sewage in the last few days. And it's just staggering seeing how many red blobs are on that, and seeing the amount of little brown lines, which are all polluted rivers essentially, that are all feeding into this amazing ecosystem. Like Simon was saying, this is an important pit stop for birds all around the world on their migrations. And like Dermot just showed you then, these are amazing spaces with some beautiful wildlife. And yet we've got all this pollution sort of running into the whole sort of area. So I think I want to really turn my talk about what we can do about it. And I want to point you to, first of all, some resources. So I think as a conservation movement, we all need to be working together, and we all need to be supporting sort of the work that we're all doing to make sure we're speaking with the same unified voice. So I will spotlight River Action here and their River Rescue Kit, because if you are really passionate about campaigning, I think the first thing to do is look around and see if there's a local group in your area that is doing something about water quality, see if you can join it, see if you can get involved. But if there's not, this has got lots of resources on how to set up your own group and begin sort of starting to campaign around water pollution. And obviously, you've heard about the rights of rivers from Lorna today. Now, she's given a fantastic talk and referenced how local community action has really sort of come together and put pressure on local councils to sort of take action for their rivers. And I say, why can't we do that here in Cheshire? So what we're doing now as Cheshire Wildlife Trust is we're going to back that movement as well. Lorna was talking about how it's part of a wider movement nationally in the UK, and we want to play a part in that here with the Mersey in particular. And I suppose it's not just the Mersey really. If you are sort of thinking about all the other rivers that feed into the Mersey, it's those as well, because at the end of the day, we've got to be thinking of this from a catchment scale level where all water from source to mouth is clean and flowing freely. So what we've done is we've set up a letter to council action. So this is one of the things you can do on the back of today's webinar after hearing all these talks. All you need to do really is type in your details, okay, and postcode, and find your councillor there. It does it automatically for you. And then this is the tricky bit. So Lorna mentioned they've got a template on the website. I've not been quite so generous. What I would love you to do is you to send a personal letter. And I know it takes a little bit more time, but what I've put on here is a scaffold of questions. And if you just answer these questions, what you should be able to do is create a nice personal message to your councillor. The feedback I've had from councillors when I talk to them and ask them to do something for wildlife is they say, when we get letters, it's more important that people are speaking with their own voice rather than just hearing it from like a wildlife trust perspective. At the end of the day, you're their constituents. They are the people that are elected by you. So you have a power over them that I don't sometimes. But when you start speaking up and I'm speaking up, that's when our voices start to amplify. And it's a two sort of side of the coin, really. We've got to both, the elected people have got to hear from their constituents, and also hear from like the likes of the Wildlife Trust and NGOs who are speaking from an expert perspective. So one of my pleas for you today is let's back this Rights of Rivers motion. Let's get it going here in Cheshire. So if you follow that action, and we'll send this out afterwards, you'll be able to write your own letter, explain why you want to see rivers cleaned up in the UK, why you want them flowing freely, and all those other rights that Lorna mentioned before, and really put that case forward. Because if we think back to that sort of thing I showed you a couple of seconds ago, if I'll flick back to it, look at that area there. There's so many councils across that area, and it's only if we all get them on side that we're going to be able to clean up the Mersey and make sure it's free and suitable for wildlife. So that's one thing I just want to touch on today. And then Dermot's kind of alluded to the other threat that we've got in the area. So upstream, I suppose the main problem we've got is sort of pollution and sewage and all that. But downstream, we've got a very different kind of threat. We've got development pressure. And in particular, I do want to spotlight the Mersey barrage. We did a webinar obviously back in May about this and some of the potential risks. And I don't want today to focus all about that and what the threats are, because the reality is we still don't know a lot of that. We're months on, we still haven't got much more of an idea of what we did before, because there's just not enough information coming out of that at the moment. But what I do want to sort of just flag is sort of how pressing an issue this is becoming now. So a report came out only a few weeks ago, it was the end of October, from NESO. Now, this is the National Energy Systems Operator. And this body has the responsibility for planning out the future of energy in the UK and sort of mapping out our path to net zero. And it was asking the question, should tidal range energy, which includes barrages and tidal lagoons, should that play a part in our future? And they considered sort of 4 different scenarios. They considered not doing anything at all and not putting any tidal range schemes online in the UK. And then 3 different levels of ambition, from a low ambition scenario to a high ambition scenario. So it's been interesting to sort of know that this is in the pipeline, but it's now being released. And I can show you, this is sort of what they're recommending in their report. So they're advocating for 1 or 2 scenarios here. Either the scenario where we don't do any tidal range energy in the UK. And the reason they've said that might be something to consider is because it's by far cheaper for people. But then the other thing that they've said is that it offers some different benefits that other energy doesn't. So there's a bit more regularity to sort of the timings of energy compared to like solar and wind, for example. So although it's more expensive, they basically said it might be worth considering doing. But they've only recommended a low ambition scenario. However, I don't want that to sort of make us feel a sense of security, because the locations they've spotlighted for that in that low ambition scenario are the northwest and the southwest, which is essentially the River Severn and the River Mersey. So it sort of hammers home that this is a pressing threat for our river and estuary. And what I do just want to sort of highlight as well is in this report, it kind of indicates that the Mersey would be the first one. It sort of puts out some timings, and it seems to suggest that this is the one that's the furthest on. So we are very much on the front line in a way for this sort of project. So what we're going to do about it, that's the question. And I think the key message I want to say today is that we need more scrutiny, and we need independent scrutiny at that over what's going on. So what we're going to do is we want to call for an independent Mersey Estuary Commission to look into tidal power in the Mersey. If we are going to be on the forefront of it, and that decision is going to be made probably nationally, not locally, we need to make sure that a holistic look has been taken with this sort of approach. And the example I'll give is the Severn Estuary Commission. So down south, what they did was establish a panel of experts in very different fields. They had energy engineers, they had business and finance people, but they also had ecologists and environmental experts. And what their job was to do was to come together, talk about it, and broker a bit of a consensus on the best way forward. And their overall recommendation in the end, they said, don't do a barrage, do a tidal lagoon, because it's going to deliver everything we want, essentially, from energy, finance, economy, and job benefits, but it will have the minimal impact on the environment. And I think that's the conversation we've not had up here in the Mersey. And I think that's what we need to start off, a conversation about what's the best holistic solution for an environment, for energy, for finance, for the climate. So we're thinking about it in the round rather than thinking it from any one particular lens. So my call to action today is for you to go away and please can you back our open letter. You can sign this as an individual or a group. If you want to see that independent scrutiny, then please do back it, because the more people that speak up and the more people that call for us, the stronger our voices and the more likely we are to get that scrutiny. I hope the sort of talks earlier have given you a sense of what might be at risk if something like this came forward. And as details start to emerge, I think it's really important that we know that this is an important space for nature. We have to protect it. We have to look after it. If we destroy it, it can't just be recreated. We've got to keep our international commitments here and our commitments to our local wildlife and international wildlife. And I suppose if you are really passionate about campaigning on this, we have now launched our Mersey Campaigner Pack. That's available online as well. Got lots of useful information on the local wildlife, from the wildlife present to the different sort of habitats there and the values that they bring towards not just wildlife. And there's also things like creative campaigning tips and timelines for what we're expecting as well. So we're putting that on as a resource. So I suppose if there's one takeaway message I want you to come away with, it's please can you take some sort of action. We've got an amazing environmental asset on our doorstep. It's, as Simon was saying, almost like this savannah, this wildlife hotspot on our doorsteps, as Dermot puts it. And like Lorna has shown, local action really does add up and make change happen. And we need you to sort of join us in this battle. So regardless of what the threat is, we need you to speak up. And the more of us that do so will help us protect the Mersey for generations to come. And on that note, I will hand back to Faye.
Thanks, James. Fantastic. But thank you ever so much. If you have any questions after the fact or want to put us in contact with community groups, I know people have mentioned the Anglers and other such groups, please do let us know. If you're a group who wants to support us or wants to know more, we'll share our campaigner pack as well. I just want to say a huge thank you to all our speakers. Thank you so much for giving us your time and sharing all your wonderful expertise with us. And thank you so much for attending. I hope you have a really good night.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Good night.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye.
Good night.